All right, our last two sections of the nervous system part two, we have 11.6, which is the peripheral nervous system, and 11.7, the autonomic nervous system. So 11.6, the peripheral nervous system, abbreviated PNS. This is our objectives. We are going to distinguish between the major parts of the peripheral nervous system, describe the structure of peripheral nerve and how its fibers are classified, identify the cranial nerves and list their major functions, and then explain how spinal nerves are named and their functions. So the peripheral nervous system basically consists of nerves that extend to and from the central nervous system organs. In other words, the PNS includes the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. So the peripheral nervous system connects all body parts to the brain and or spinal cord. The PNS is divided into a sensory and motor branches, and the motor branch of the peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into a somatic nervous system from the central nervous system to skin and skeletal muscles, and an autonomic nervous system, which goes from the central nervous system to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and endocrine glands. So here you can see the nervous system subdivisions. You have the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, the peripheral nervous system, which includes cranial nerves arising from the brain, and they include both somatic fibers connecting to the skin and skeletal muscles and autonomic fibers connecting to viscera. And then you have the spinal nerves arising from the spinal cord, and you have somatic fibers connecting to the skin and skeletal muscles and autonomic fibers connecting to viscera. So the structure of a peripheral nerve. A peripheral nerve is a cord-like bundle of axons that are wrapped in connective tissue. So you can see this in the picture here. There are three types of connective tissue wrappings that are similar to that of muscle. You have the endoneurium, which is around each axon and its myelin sheath. You have the peroneurium, which is around each fascicle or bundle of axons. And then you have the epineurium, which is around each nerve. So here you can see the endo, peri, and epineurium in the diagram. Nerve and nerve fiber classification. You have sensory nerves. Sensory nerves are also known as afferent nerves. And these are nerves that only carry sensory impulses toward the central nervous system. They are composed of only sensory axons, and they are rare because there are only 3 pairs of cranial nerves. Then you have motor or efferent nerves. Motor efferent nerves are nerves that only carry motor impulses away from that central nervous system. They are composed of only motor axons, and they are rare because there are only 5 pairs of cranial nerves. And then you have those that are mixed, which act as both sensory and motor nerves. And these are the nerves that are going to carry the impulses from both to and from that central nervous system. It contains both sensory and motor axons. It's most common in two-way communication, and all the spinal nerves and 4 pairs of cranial nerves act as mixed nerves. A continuation of nerve fiber classification, there are 4 groups of general nerves. You have the general somatic efferent fibers, and these are going to be motor to skeletal muscles. You have the general visceral efferent fibers, and this is going to motor to smooth and cardiac muscle and glands. You have the general somatic afferent fibers. These are sensory from skin and skeletal muscles. And then you have the general visceral afferent fibers, and these are going to be sensory from blood vessels and internal organs. In addition, you have nerve fiber classification. Nerve fiber classification, there are 3 groups of special nerves. You have the special somatic efferent fibers, And special somatic efferent fibers, these are motor to skeletal muscle for chewing, swallowing, speech, and facial expression. Then you have special visceral afferent fibers, and these are sensory for smell and taste. And lastly, you have special somatic afferent fibers, and this is sensory for sight, hearing, and equilibrium. All right, in the peripheral nervous system, here are the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves themselves, there are 12 pairs, 2 pairs to and from the forebrain, and 10 pairs that are going to be to and from the brain stem. And if you look closely at those cranial nerves, note that they are designated by Roman numerals. So we have 1 through 12 in Roman numeral fashion there. And we're going to take a look at each of those very quickly in the peripheral nervous system. So the cranial nerves are designated with Roman numerals 1 to 12. And here we have cranial nerves 1 and 2. So cranial nerve 1 is an olfactory nerve, and it is plays a role in the sense of smell. It's sensory only. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. It's the sense of vision. It's a sensory nerve only. Cranial nerve 3, that is oculomotor. That innervates eye muscles. It's motor only. So it could raise eyelids, move the eyes, focus the lens, adjust light entering the eyes. You do have some sensory parts to the oculomotor nerve. These are called proprioceptors. Then you have the trochlear nerve, that's nerve 4, and it's going to innervate eye muscles. So with doing that, motor impulse to the eyes, and it's going to help the eyes move. The trigeminal nerve 5, that is the largest sensory from face. It's the motor to chewing muscles, and it serves as a mixed nerve. So you have 3 divisions here. As far as that mixed nerve, you have the ophthalmic division, maxillary division, and you have the mandibular division. Nerve 6 is the abducens nerve. That's going to innervate eye muscles. It serves as a motor nerve. Nerve 7 is a facial nerve. It's a mixed nerve. It's going to innervate muscles of facial expressions and sensory taste. Nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that's going to sense of hearing and equilibrium. So it's a sensory nerve. Nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. That's going to move the tongue and the pharynx muscles, and it's going to play a sensory role in taste, so it serves as a mixed nerve. Nerve 10, this is the vagus nerve, and that's going to innervate visceral smooth muscle and sensation from those organs. It serves as a mixed nerve. So you can check that nerve out. Then you have accessory nerve 11, and that's going to innervate the neck muscles. It's a motor only nerve. And lastly, you have the hypoglossal nerve. And the hypoglossal nerve is going to move the tongue, and that is a motor only nerve. So here is a chart illustrating the functions of the cranial nerves. You have olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, ophthalmic division, maxillary division, mandibular division. You have the abducens, the facial, the vestibulocochlear, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and the accessory. And then you have also in there the hypoglossal. So to remember these, here is a mnemonic device. One, at least, you come up with your own, but you can remember it as O, 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 to touch and feel very good velvet. Ah. O, 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 to touch and feel very good velvet. Ah. All right, the spinal nerves. As far as spinal nerves are, recall that a spinal nerve is formed from the fusion of dorsal and ventral root. The spinal nerve passes through its intervertebral foramen. The spinal nerves are associated with the spinal cord and are named for the region of the spinal cord from which they arise. So these are all mixed nerves, and you could have basically 31 pairs, and they are C1 through C8, T1 through T12, L1 through L5, S1 through S5, and C0. So you have 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 5 sacral nerves, and 1 coccygeal nerve. Spinal nerves, as far as distribution, it is a short distance after passing through its intervertebral foramen. A spinal nerve branches into several branches. You have the posterior branch, or the dorsal ramus. You have a large anterior branch, which is the ventral ramus, and then the branches of the paravertebral autonomic ganglia, which is the rami communicans. So the dorsal root, or sensory root, the dorsal root ganglion, remember that these are cell bodies of sensory neurons whose axons conduct impulses inward from peripheral body parts. So let's take a look at these difference. Here you have the ventral root. The ventral root is that anterior root. It's a motor root. The axon of the motor neuron whose cell bodies are in the spinal cord. And then you have the spinal nerve, which is a union of that ventral root and that dorsal root. So hence we now have a mixed nerve. And those branches of spinal nerve, you have the meningeal branch, the dorsal branch, the ventral branch, and the visceral branch that are all playing a role there. So let's take a look at some of these spinal nerves. First, you have the nerve plexus. And the nerve plexus it's defined as a branching network of the anterior branches of the ventral rami of spinal nerves. So the nerves do not extend directly to the body part, they innervate. Instead, they are going to form networks. The fibers of various spinal nerves are sorted and recombined. There are 3 basic nerve plexuses. The first is the cervical plexus, and these are all present in all spinal nerves except T2 and T12. The cervical plexus is the neck muscles and the diaphragm, which is going to play a role for breathing. The brachial plexus, this is going to play a role with the upper limbs. So you can see it's formed by the anterior branches C5 through T1. It lies deep within shoulders. There are 5 branches. You have the musculocutaneous nerve. You have the ulnar and median nerves. You have the radial nerve and the axillary nerve. And you can see their descriptions all in there as far as what they are doing. Then you have the lumbosacral plexus, and this is anterior and medial thighs and posterior lower limbs. So if you look there, there are 3 of them. You have the obturator nerve, the femoral nerve, and the sciatic nerve. The obturator nerve is going to supply motor impulses to adductors of the thighs. The femoral nerve is going to supply motor impulses to muscles of the anterior thigh. and sensory impulses from the skin of the thighs and legs, and the sciatic nerve supply muscles and skin of thighs and legs and feet. So as far as the plexuses, each result in branch of the plexus contains fibers from several spinal nerves. The fibers from each spinal nerve are carried to the body's periphery via several different roots or branches. Therefore, damage to one of the spinal segment cannot completely paralyze any limb or muscle. You also have intercostal nerves. These are nerves T2 through T11, and they're going to run in intercostal spaces. And basically, what do? These supply the skin with and muscles in the surrounding area. So when they supply the skin, it's acting as sensory. When it's supplying to the muscles, that's going to act as a motor. And lastly, 11.7, the autonomic nervous system. Our objectives for the autonomic nervous system are to characterize the ANS, distinguish between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the ANS, compare the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve pathways, and explain how the autonomic neurotransmitters differently affect visceral effectors. So, introduction, general characteristics of the autonomic nervous system is that it regulates the actions of smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and some glands. In other words, the autonomic nervous system is going to regulate involuntary autonomic unconscious actions. There are two major divisions of the ANS. There is the parasympathetic division, which functions under normal conditions to maintain homeostasis. And then there is the sympathetic division of the ANS, which is going to function under stress. So here you have the general characteristics. So the sympathetic division under stress is going to speed up. It prepares the body for that fight or flight situation. The parasympathetic is going to slow the body down, resting and digesting activities. So let's look at autonomic nerve fibers. All the neurons are motor or efferent. So you have two motor neurons. The synapse between the neuron occurs within a ganglion. Basically, a ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Effectors are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. You have the two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. If we look at the sympathetic first, the sympathetic division functions in that fight or flight response. The postganglionic fiber is going to secrete the neurotransmitter epinephrine. So you have the preganglionic neuron, which is short. It's going to rise from the thoracolumbar regions, T1 and L2 of the spine. The general pathway is quite complex, but just know that the preganglionic neuron from the spinal cord goes out through the white ramus communicans to enter an adjoining paravertebral chain ganglion, forming the part of the sympathetic trunk. So you have the preganglionic fibers and the postganglionic fibers. So here you can see a little bit more detailed in this. So when you have that forming the part of the sympathetic trunk or chain, once that preganglionic axon reaches the paravertebral ganglion, one of three things could happen. The first thing that could happen is it can synapse with the postganglionic neuron within the same ganglion. And that synapse is in a paravertebral chain ganglion is at the same level. The postganglionic neuron then passes through that gray ramus communicans and out of the ventral ramus, leading to its effector, which could be a blood vessel or the skin. The second thing that could happen is it can ascend or descend within the sympathetic chain to a synapse and another paravertebral ganglion, and that synapse in the paravertebral chain ganglion is at a different level. So the postganglionic neuron can pass through the gray ramus communicans. And then the third thing that could happen is it can pass through the ganglion to a prevertebral ganglion, which is collateral, and therefore the synapse is going to occur within the prevertebral ganglion and the postsynaptic neuron, which extends to the effector. And that you see often in abdominal organs. So here you can see that in the abdominal organs. So the exception there, the preganglionic fibers to the adrenal medulla do not synapse with the postganglionic neurons. Here's another picture of the sympathetic divisions. The parasympathetic division, it's going to function to maintain homeostasis. You have the postganglionic fibers, which are going to secrete acetylcholine. The ganglia are located at or near the effector. You have preganglionic neuron, which is long, and one of those, the long, are going to arise from the craniosacral regions of the brain and spinal cord, and they are going to follow a simple pathway, and those preganglionic fibers follow blood vessels to ganglion in or near the wall of the effector. So if you look here, the craniosacral division is location of the preganglionic neurons, the ganglion near or within various organs, so they're terminal ganglia. You have short postganglionic fibers that continue to be specific muscles or glands. You have preganglionic fibers of the head, which are included in nerves 3, 7, and 9. And you have preganglionic fibers of the thorax and abdomen, which are parts of nerve 10. So autonomic nervous system, yeah, the autonomic neurotransmitters. You have cholinergic fibers. Let me quick look that up. Which are going to release acetylcholine, and those are preganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, postganglionic parasympathetic fibers. So the autonomic neurotransmitters are going to be acetylcholine, which is going to be released. Cholinergic. Okay, the correct pronunciation of that would be cholinergic fibers. So you have acetylcholine, which is going to be released by the cholinergic fibers or axons, and then you have the norepinephrine. That's a neurotransmitter, and norepinephrine is going to be released by the adrenergic fibers, and those would be the axons there. Again, I apologize for the pronunciation of some of these things. I too am diving a little bit more into the nervous system myself here. So actions of the autonomic neurotransmitters. Basically, it is a receptor. It's present in the cell membrane of an effector, and it's going to recognize its neurotransmitter, allowing for a response to occur within the effector. So you could see the two different there and what they are doing. The effectors of the autonomic simulation on various effectors. So you have the visceral effectors. So over here you have acetylcholine, norepinephrine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, acetylcholine. Actions of the autonomic neurotransmitters. Basically, what you see is result from binding protein receptors in the membrane of effector cells. You have destruction of neurotransmitter. So acetylcholinesterase is going to destroy acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction. So it only has a momentary effect. It occurs within a fraction of a second. Then you have the reuptake of that neurotransmitter. Much of the norepinephrine is transported back into the postsynaptic fiber through active transport. The enzyme monoamine oxidase in the mitochondria activates epinephrine and norepinephrine after reuptake. However, the process takes several seconds in order for that to occur. Some norepinephrine escapes and is then decomposed, and norepinephrine response may last as long as about 30 seconds. The overall, you could see some of the effector cells. So terminating the autonomic neurotransmitter actions, I just went through that. The control of autonomic activity. So overall, the central nervous system controls the autonomic nervous system. And basically what you have there is first, the medulla oblongata is going to control visceral activities. So cardiac, heart rate and rhythm, vasomotor, which is blood pressure, respiratory functions, depth of breathing. You have the limbic system in the cerebral cortex that's going to control the emotional responses. Remember, that's your emotional control center. You also have the hypothalamus. That is going to regulate visceral control, including the renal and digestive part. So we'll look at these. We'll fill in some charts for a quick summary of both the ANS and the PNS. And we'll look at the branches of the ANS, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Here are some lifespan changes as far as the central nerves or the nervous system part 2 is concerned. Basically, brain cells begin to die before birth. Overall average lifetime, the brain shrinks 10%. Most cell death occurs in the temporal lobes. By age 90, the frontal cortex has lost half its neurons. So remember, the temporal lobe, by age 90, most cell death occurs in those temporal lobes. Remember, that is your pleasure pain center. By age 90, the frontal cortex has lost half its neurons. The frontal cortex is all about reasoning, logic, all those other things, some of your skills. You have also the number of dendritic branches decrease. You have decreased levels of neurotransmitters. Therefore, with some of these, you get fading memory, slowed response system reflexes, so you start to lose some of that motor function. You have that increased risk of falling because you lose that center of balance. And then you also get the changes in sleep patterns, and typically that results in fewer sleeping hours. And if you think of an elderly person, you can see some of these things in them. Okay, that's it for chapter 11.